Will the United Kingdom walk out of the European Union without a deal? And what would a no-deal Brexit mean for the EU and the rest of the world? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. Nearly 3 years after the UK voted to leave the EU and after 3 failed attempts to push a deal through Parliament, there is still deadlock and uncertainty about how to deliver Brexit. Whoever succeeds Theresa May as Prime Minister will have to find a way out of the crisis. There are 10 candidates vying for the top job. The leading contender is Boris Johnson. He wants the UK to leave the EU with or without a deal by October 31st, the current deadline. In just a few moments, we'll be speaking with Widdecombe, newly elected member of the European Parliament. She represents the Brexit Party, which won a majority of UK seats in last month's elections. But first, we go to Germany, the largest economy in Europe, to see what Europeans in Berlin think about Brexit.
Personally, I don't think it's going to affect me in an economic sense, but it definitely affects how I think about the EU and how I choose to live my life, because I want to live in a way that I can cross borders in any way, possible, not just from country to country, but I would wish for Europe to become a place where we can move openly, where we can tolerate each other, accept other cultures, learn from other cultures, instead of kind of drawing up the walls of fear.
I think in this period it's worse for the UK citizens, and I know a lot of people that actually are leaving UK, especially London, coming to Berlin because they actually lost the faith in their system. Them leaving will also have a big influence in how daily business in Europe is run. Their place is going to be taken by other countries, and to be honest, I don't know how that's going to look like.
I guess there will be layoffs, and maybe some companies will justify the layoffs because of the Brexit. Yeah, we have to let go a lot of people because the trades and the business will not go as we expected, and so we have to leave all the people or lay off all the people.
I think the Brits are still not aware what a hard Brexit would mean and all the implications of actually leaving Europe.
And they haven't got a clue. You're absolutely right. They haven't got a clue, and they're ploughing on regardless, directly towards disaster. And it just, the mind boggles. I mean, I left Britain because of Brexit. I'm here in Germany because I'm a European, and it's insane that we should think about leaving Europe. If you think back to the Olympics in 2004 and how the world saw Britain as a country that was opening up and part of the world, now it's a place that's building walls and hiding behind tariffs, and it's just, they've lost it. They're victims of a right-wing surge, and it's going to change the country profoundly unless they're able to correct their ways.
Most Europeans, in my opinion, are at a similar point, just it hasn't gotten this far. So it could totally happen in Germany as well. When you look like right now after the European elections, if you look at it, like the right-wing parties have gained a lot of attention and a lot of votes and percentage, so I think since the UK is that much smaller and like things seem to be moving faster, they already got there. But I think this is really like a wake-up call for us to change our ways and to really choose. And I think what we have to choose is between fear and another way, a way of seeing opportunities.
Brexit comes from 10 years of austerity, 10 years of Tory government, basically. Yeah. It's the destruction of social services, the destruction of the idea that a society cares for you. In Britain, there's no hope now. The poor are being crushed. I don't see anything beneficial coming from it.
It's never gonna be the same again, because there will always be the sting of, yeah, you turned your back on us and now you still want to make business with us. I think then that's a personal thing where people might feel, like they're personally insulted by that decision.
So then, what's the view from the UK and within the newly formed Brexit Party? Joining me now to talk about this is Widdecombe, a newly elected Brexit Party member of the European Parliament and a long-time former MP in the British Conservative Party. Widdecombe, thanks so much for joining us. People outside the United Kingdom, in Germany, elsewhere in Europe, and here in the United States, as you well know, are looking at this whole Brexit saga and scratching their heads. You yourself said this is beyond parody and that Britain has become an international laughingstock. Who's to blame for this mess? And more importantly, how do you get out of it?
Well, I think those statements are true. I think there are lots of hands on the tiller of this particular voyage to disaster and mess. First of all, of course, Theresa May lost her majority in Parliament in a completely unnecessary general election. Then she insisted on bringing back the same deal time and time again, even though Parliament regularly rejected it. Meanwhile, you've got to look at the opposition, the official opposition, which of course over here is the Labour Party. They don't even have a clear policy on Brexit because in both parties there are major divisions. And the Remain faction, of course, in Parliament. Our problem can best be summed up thus. 52% of the British public want to leave the EU. 75% of parliamentarians want to stay. And that, I think, is what is at the root of our problems.
So you blame Theresa May, you blame the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, Parliament as well for failing to get on with it. But does the Brexit Party have a workable plan to get on with it? What is your solution?
As far as the Brexit Party is concerned, there is now only one solution. We've had 3 years of messing around. We're no nearer a solution now than we were when we started. And the view of the Brexit Party is that we leave on October the 31st, which is the latest scheduled date. We leave on October the 31st without a deal.
So you leave without a deal?
Without a deal. And at that stage, having made a clean break, we can negotiate a trade deal with Europe.
But that is simply not realistic. You've got many people speaking up against this. You've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, saying that there's very, very small chance that this would happen and that it would indeed be very unwise.
I do not believe it unwise at all. You've made several points there. First of all, it doesn't matter what the Chancellor says. Whatever this government has not been carried by Parliament. Now, a lot of people are saying, OK, if that's the only way through, just do it. Just let's get there. The Bank of England says 90% of British business is ready. 92% of British business doesn't even export to the EU. The EU say they're ready for no deal. So where is this big disaster other than a project of fear, which was carried out, of course, at the time of the referendum and failed?
So is it a project of fear when you hear from the British government and the central bank making doomsday scenario predictions? A report by the government itself said that the UK was not ready, that it would risk severely damaging its own economy. A no-deal Brexit would shrink the British economy by as much as 9% if it faces significant trade barriers. The central bank warned that the unemployment rate would almost double, that the pound would crash by 25%. I mean, surely these must be alarming signals, aren't they?
They would be alarming if we believed them, but you don't seem to realise that we've heard all this before. We were told in terms that if the British people so much as voted to leave, never mind left, but voted to leave, very next day, unemployment was going to go up by 500,000. There would have to be an austerity budget. There would have to be tax rises. None of those things happened. And so we're not going to believe the same people giving the same scenarios now when Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, says 90% of British business is ready. The EU say, we don't say, they say, they're ready. We're ready for this. We can do it. All we need is the will to do it.
Well, you may be ready for this, but the majority of MPs seemingly aren't. The majority of MPs are opposed to leaving the EU without a deal. I mean, surely there is the need for some kind of compromise, isn't there? Some kind of negotiation. Are you willing to engage in that? Is Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party willing to compromise?
Well, Nigel Farage has said that we have a right now to a place at the negotiations. We have come top of the poll in the EU elections. We have an absolute right to a place in those negotiations. But you talk about compromise. We've spent 3 years getting into a mess with various offers of compromise. The time has come now to say we're going on the due date. And everything else can be worked out afterwards. And remember, we're not just going into nothing. We're going to WTO terms. I mean, it's very clear what's going to happen.
But that means higher tariffs for the UK. Are you willing to accept those new trade rules?
Well, first of all, Tusk himself offered us a zero tariff deal. So, it does not necessarily mean higher tariffs. That is the whole point. There is a real concerted effort to scare us the whole time. And don't forget, the EU also imports from us. So they're concerned about tariffs too. They don't want chaos in their ports. They do want the divorce money. So therefore, the pressure of no deal will, I think, bring them to their senses much quicker than if they think, as they do at the moment, think there is no real will on the part of the British Parliament to leave. And they're right to think that.
But the point is, you don't know, no one really knows what the future holds and what a no-deal Brexit means. Isn't it perhaps time to accept that this mess is not something that most people who voted for Brexit back in June 2016 had any idea about? Is it perhaps time to say, OK, things have not worked out, let's put this to a second referendum?
Well, there was only one reason for voting Brexit in the European elections, and that was if you wanted a Brexit without a deal, because that was what we actually put on the table. And we topped the poll. After only being in being for about 8 weeks, our party topped the poll. And that is because the British people want a solution. They were reaffirming their vote of 2016. We had a referendum in 1975. We had a second referendum many decades later. The European elections, as far as I'm concerned, were a third referendum, and the answer's the same every single time. Britain wants to leave that great leviathan of a superstate.
Well, sure, but if you're so confident about this, why not have a reaffirmation? And also on the second point that you made, you said that the Brexit Party put a no deal on the table during the elections, but it seems like Nigel Farage, the head of the party, is now wavering, is now talking about wanting a seat at the EU negotiating table. So do you or don't you want to negotiate your way out?
As far as we're concerned, we should now be involved in those negotiations. But if we're involved in them, no deal will be on the table, and no deal will be how we propose to leave on the 31st if trade terms haven't been agreed between now and then. It really is as simple as that. Nigel Farage is not wavering. He has never wavered from his position. He's one of the very few politicians in this country who hasn't.
Moving on who might be able to deliver on Brexit. Obviously Theresa May couldn't. Do you think Boris Johnson might be able to, or someone else who may be able to work out some kind of a compromise? Because as you say, the British public is divided almost down the middle on this.
No, we're not down the middle. There's a majority amongst the British public to leave. And I won't be told that that majority doesn't exist. It was demonstrated in 2016. It was demonstrated again in the recent Euro elections. The British public wants to leave. Parliament does not. Now, that is our essential problem. And whoever succeeds Theresa May, be it Boris or be it anybody else, is going to be faced with that very simple problem. And that is why that person has to have the guts to say, right, we haven't found a solution. The only thing to do is to leave on the due date. And if we haven't got a deal by then, tough luck.
If you were to make one prediction, one bet on any of the contenders for the top job, who will be able to deliver on this, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure that any of them are going to be able to do it, because I'm not sure that any of them has the necessary will or can command the backing of Parliament. So, and what's more, I'm not making any predictions at all about the Conservative Party leadership. I will start making predictions and listening seriously to my old party when and only when they're down to the last 3 or 4 and we can see who might or might not be there. It is a shambles. The whole of the British Parliament at the moment is a shambles. It's the worst since Oliver Cromwell's time.
How much faith do you then have with your former long-time party, the Conservative Party?
At the moment, none. Absolutely zero. That's why I left. If I'd had any residual faith in it at all, this is a party that I was in for 55 years. It's a party that I served in and out of Parliament, in government office, in the shadow cabinet, and I simply at the moment have no faith in it at all.
Finally, when you look at the way things have gone so far, and when you hear people who have been engaged in these negotiations, people like Sir Ivan Rogers, who was the former British representative to the EU, say that it is pure fantasy to believe that there could be a clean break from the EU, that this whole thing could actually take years, maybe 10 years, if not more. Are you willing to accept that this actually is not going to happen overnight?
Nobody wants it to happen overnight. I want it to happen on October the 31st. And yeah, I quite believe it could take 20, 30, 40, 50 years if left to this Parliament. But The position of the Brexit Party is that if this Parliament goes on making this eternal mess, which it's making at the moment, then come the next general election, we will be fielding candidates in every seat.
Anne Widdecombe, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
The European Union is the world's third largest economy and a major global trading bloc. The EU is the UK's largest commercial partner, but with a potential no-deal Brexit, what are the economic risks for all sides? Aus Haidari has our 5 facts.
In the event of a no-deal Brexit, the United Kingdom's economy would suffer. By most accounts, a no-deal Brexit would see the UK sink into a recession with more than 10% loss in GDP, 30% fall in housing prices, a rise in unemployment, and a weakened British pound against the US dollar. Hundreds of billions in lost assets. It is predicted that the UK would lose more than 900 billion worth of assets as several banks move their operations out of London. Already, some 275 finance companies have begun relocating, moving staff, or setting up new entities in the EU. Major losses in jobs. Without an agreement with the EU, an estimated 745,000 jobs could be lost in the UK. But Brexit's economic troubles apply to the European Union as well. No more free trade. Without a deal, Brexit would activate tariffs by the WTO, which are in the upwards of 15%. Countries closest to the UK, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, as well as those with high volume of trade, such as Germany and France, will suffer the biggest economic impact. No more free movement. The UK is the third largest remittance-sending country in the European Union, and in 2017, migrant workers from the EU sent home about $9 billion. In the event of a no deal, restrictions or requirements for new migrant workers could come sooner than expected.
So then, how will all of this affect relations between the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe? To discuss, we're joined by Hilary Fordwich. She's on the board of directors of the British American Business Association. She's also president and founder of Strelmark, a business development consultancy. We're also joined by Theodore Christov, a professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University. Welcome to you both. Hilary Fordwich, it looks like EU leaders are getting fed up with the UK and with the way this whole Brexit process has been dragging on. Germany's Europe minister is warning that the EU, quote, will not be blackmailed. Will Brexit necessarily make the EU as a bloc weaker? Or could you also argue that the United Kingdom was never wholeheartedly a member of the EU? It was never part of the Schengen area. It had never adopted the euro. In a way, could it actually, paradoxically, make the EU a stronger bloc not to have the UK in it?
Well, if you have both sides not taking recriminating stances against the other one, I think so. Look, Norway certainly isn't totally part of the EU. Neither is Switzerland. I think that it's not the ideal situation for the EU, but should it actually take place on October 31st as planned, I envision that Juncker and the rest of them, as long as, again, they don't take sort of retaliatory steps. The bottom line is that you have, for example, German manufacturers. 1 out of 7 cars goes into the UK. The European markets need the UK way more than the UK needs Europe. 93% of all products that are purchased from the UK, from Europe, can be purchased elsewhere. Already 2 major UK hotel chains and restaurant chains have already switched their wine purchases to California wine versus French wines. So while the EU has been desperate to hold the UK in, once this happens, what do you think? German manufacturers are going to say, no, actually, we'd rather not sell 1 of our 7 cars into the UK. The pressure is going to come from those that are realists, not bureaucrats, and that is, we want to sell our products into the UK still, and they'll put pressure on the politicians to be reasonable.
Theo Christoph, interestingly though, the UK is, for the United States, the #1 market within the European Union. So quite important for the US car manufacturing industry, pharmaceuticals, as well as the banking sector. I wonder to what extent you feel that Britain, although it is no longer the great empire it once was, a Britain outside of the EU loses its relevance and significance, not just for the United States, but for other players in the world.
There's a paradox at the heart of Brexit. On the one hand, Britain wants to reclaim its sovereignty, and I'm using the language of its own politicians. On the other hand, what they want to do is be part of the single market of this customs union that they have been a part of since 1973. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too, as the Brits themselves say. So what we need to do is address the paradox at the very heart of Brexit. And the question really becomes, what is the feeling? What is the sensibility that has been driving Brexit within Britain itself? And I do think there is a very strong sense of imperial nostalgia. What we have been seeing is precisely the sense that Britain was the global power, and they have been losing over the past few decades through the process of globalization much of their influence around the world.
I would actually refer to it as though something a little bit different. I would call it the Stilton sausage argument. You know what that is? Stilton cheese is blue English cheese. Cannot be sold into the EU, whereas Gorgonzola and Roquefort can be sold into the UK. Who are those regulations made by? Bureaucrats in Brussels who are predominantly European. Sausage argument. Do you know there are more regulations about how a Devonshire farmer is to make his sausages than there are about immigration? So the frustration actually was about unelected bureaucrats, faceless bureaucrats, imposing regulations on a nation that were biased for the EU. And I think that has been the heart of issues. When the vote, if you look at the voting map, 17.4 million in predominantly England, but England and Wales voted to leave. If you look at where they're located and the kind of businesses and industries they're in, they're heavily taxed, the money goes to the EU, but they don't receive it back and they're too heavily regulated.
It sounds like a familiar refrain, something that we actually heard quite a bit of here in 2016 in the campaign leading up to Donald Trump's election. Do you see a similar correlation, Theodore Christov? Because Brexit, you could argue, was the first official expression of that new growing trend of populism around the world, certainly in Europe, here in the United States as well. Steve Bannon actually recently said, and he's of course the White House's chief strategist formerly, he said that if Brexit hadn't happened, Trump would not have been elected. Do you agree?
Yes, up to a point. I do think that what we have been seeing is the results of globalization. There has been a pushback against immigration, against people flooding the streets of London, the streets of Manchester, and I think there is this sense that things have gone wrong, that for the average British person, the benefits of globalization have not been quite there. But I also want to think about the map of the 2016 referendum compared to the 1975 referendum, which was the first referendum that the British held in favor or against their European Union membership. The maps are very much the same in terms of the density of voices in favor of Brexit and against Brexit. So one could argue that, in fact, there hasn't really been much of a change. What has changed is the density of pro-Brexit people, and again, we're talking about 52 against 48%. So by and large, there has been a commonality what we have been observing here in the U.S.
And talking about the U.S. British relationship, that special relationship we often hear about, Trump recently said it was the greatest alliance the world had ever known. How do you think, Hilary, will Brexit affect that special relationship, and will the UK cease to be that all-important partner? Could it be replaced by Germany and France? Of course, there are specific cultural, linguistic ties that bind both countries, but could we actually see a more important strategic relationship developing between the United States, France and Germany?
Well, I think that actually I would defer to John Bolton, who actually quoted and was quoted when Trump was just recently over for the state visit, and he said when people talk about the UK crashing out of the EU, they're going to crash right into the United States. He was talking, of course, about a vast trade agreement. I don't ever see the same sort of deal ever being done with France and Germany directly, because you can't, because they're part of the EU, so you actually couldn't have it the same way. I will, though, say in terms of the French, I think there were two things on that. I specifically speak to the French, and that is during this state visit, I think one of the things that came out that most Americans seem totally and utterly oblivious of is that every single American boy that died on French soil, a French family has adopted that grave. And I think there were a couple of things that happened during this recent visit that repaired that. But you're right, the linguistic differences are huge. Americans don't, in vast numbers, they don't speak French and German, and they all speak English, or understand English anyway.
But it's interesting, to you, Christoph, just finally, Trump seems to be very invested for an American president in Brexit, in seeing the UK crash out of the EU, or at least leave the EU. Why do you think, and when he calls the European Union, like he did last year, a foe, do you feel that he's got a point? Do you feel that the EU has, in fact, taken advantage of the US as he says it has?
I think in the Donald Trump's universe, bilateral agreements and trade deals, as he calls them, are really central. But what we can say about any possible deal between the United States and Great Britain at this point doesn't seem to be quite likely, unless there is some renegotiation of the withdrawal agreement between now and October. So all of this talk that we have been hearing from Donald Trump that in fact we are on to our next big trade deal with Great Britain, assuming Great Britain gets out of the European Union, are simply false.
To you, Hilary, as someone who spent a lot of time in the UK, what's the way forward? Could it be a second referendum?
If there was a second referendum right now, it would be Labour, and that's exactly what Jeremy Corbyn wants, and that's why he's been holding out and wanting this to drag out, and is the only person who wants this to drag out.
All right, Hilary Fordwich and Theo Christov, thank you both very much.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
And so after decades in the making, the European Union is at a crossroads. While new trading blocs are emerging in Africa and Asia, the UK's exit from the EU deals a heavy blow to the European project. Still, the EU could become a stronger and more cohesive economic and political union, with future EU enlargement being considered more carefully than ever to ensure that commitments to the very foundation of the EU cannot be reversed by political gamble or a simple referendum. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.